Hello everybody, welcome to Chess 101. Today's lesson is we're going to talk about castling. Now you can see I've set the white pieces up on their starting squares. Now castling is a special move. It's between the king and the rooks. And actually the other pieces aren't really involved in castling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the pieces off the board that we don't use for castling. Okay, so here we have we have the king and the rooks. These are the only pieces that are involved in castling. And as you know from having watched the other video about how the pieces move, the king is a special piece. It can move in any direction, but it can only move one square. So the king from starting square has 5 squares it can move, right? And it only ever moves one square, except for castling. Now the way castling works is casting is a special move where the king gets to move 2 squares. And the way it works is the king would move 2 squares in the direction of a rook. So if it was castling over here, it would move 2 squares this way. And then this rook is just brought around and put on the other side. So over here, this is called castling king side because this is the king side of the board. Everything over here is the queen side of the board, right? So castling king side, that's the move, okay? If you castle queen side, it's the same thing. You move only 2 squares. You bring the rook around to the other side. Now what's important about this castling move, it's only one move. It's not 2 moves. So when it's white's turn, if white says, hey, I think I want to castle, they just move the king and then they move the rook, okay? Now, there's some nuances with this move. A lot of people make mistakes. So I'm going to show you the way it actually works. Okay, so first of all, the king only ever moves 2 moves. I have seen people move the king 3 and then move the rook over because that's how it looks over here, but that's not right. You only can move 2 squares, okay? Another thing is very important. Castling is a king move. It's not a rook move. If you touch your rook and move your rook over and then put the king on the other side, in a tournament, someone can call you out on it. In a touch move tournament, you should always, always, always move the king first. Don't ever move the rook first. Move the king first. It's a king move. Okay? There's some caveats to when you can and can't castle. So let's say for some reason your king was under attack and you moved it. You moved it over here. Well, now you can't castle because you've moved the king. Even if you move the king back onto its starting square later on, once you've moved your king, you can't castle. Same for the rook. If you move your rook and then move it back, you can't now castle over there. Neither of the pieces you're castling to can move. Also, here's another rule. So let's take this rook right here and let's put the rook right here. Let's say this rook is attacking the king and this is check. You're in check from this rook, right? Well, you think, well, I'm just going to get out of this by castling. I'm going to castle over here. Boom, and I'm out. Well, you can't actually castle to get out of check. If you're in check, you have to either block the check by putting another piece between it. So if you had your knight here, for example, right? You could move your knight 2 and 1 and block. And then on your next move, you can castle, okay? Having been in check doesn't mean you can't castle. It's just you can't move to get out of check, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that you can't castle through check. So let's say this bishop is sitting right here. It can move to any of these squares. So technically, if your king was here, it would be in check. And you're thinking, well, I want to castle, so I'm just going to castle over here and jump over the square of check. Well, you're not allowed to. You can't castle through check, okay? Now, you can castle over here, no problem. King's not in check, and this piece doesn't touch any of these squares, so you can castle over here. Now, you're probably saying, well, why would I want to castle? Well, in a lot of games, your pawns are like this. So a great way to get the king safe is to castle. And it also does 2 things. One is it protects the king, and the other thing is it gets the rook out, so the rook can come out to the center of the board, okay? Same thing if you castle over here. You castle over here, the rook comes over here. Now the rook's immediately coming out onto the center of the board. If you castle over here on the queen side sometimes, you have to spend another move to get him like a little safer, because if he's still in the middle of the board here a little more, if you castle queen side, he's on the C file. If you castle king side, he's on the G file, okay? Now, this is a very common thing I've seen. Let's say that this piece is gone and this rook is under attack from this rook, right? Well, I've seen where people say, oh, you can't castle because I'm attacking your rook. Well, that's actually not true. As long as the king hasn't moved, the rook hasn't moved, the king's not in check, and any of the squares the king is moving to do not deliver check, you can always castle. So even this rook here, you can castle. It doesn't matter if the rook's being attacked or whatever. It just can't have moved. Okay, and of course you can't castle into check. So you couldn't, intentionally castle here, putting yourself in check. You can't do that. It works the same way on the black side. On the, I'll set this up right here. So if the king castles, it goes to the G file, 2 squares. And over here, the king would just go, and that's what your opponent would do if they castled, okay? So a quick recap. When the king castles, it goes 2 squares toward the rook, okay? You have to touch the king first to move it first. You can't castle if you're in check or if you're castling through check. You can't do it, okay? The rook always comes only 1 square to the other side. And that's how castling works. If you have any questions, just put them in the comments below. And I've got 2 other videos with how the pieces move. One special one with how the pawns move. Another one with how the other pieces move. That's your lesson, Chess 101 today. And thanks for tuning in.